This is the Cloud Security Today podcast, where leaders learn how to get cloud security done. And now your host, Nic Chaillan.
One of the things that I often think about when innovation comes to mind are tech startups, the usual suspects, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Netflixes. I don't often think of the US government or specifically the Department of Defense. Today's guest is Nic Chaillan. He is the former Chief Software Officer of the United States Air Force. And this is just a really interesting interview. And as you'll hear, Nic has a background in actually starting up his own companies. And what he talks about, and you'll hear this over the next couple minutes, is how he uses agile development practices and DevSecOps to bring innovation. And he was able to do that successfully. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Tell us a little bit about your current role, and then we'll delve a little bit more into some other areas as well.
Yeah, so I was the first Chief Software Officer for the Air Force and Space Force. So we created this office to remove impediments to the adoption of DevSecOps and Agile, and really build enterprise services around DevSecOps so we can move at the pace of relevance and really adopt the best of breed DevSecOps practices with Kubernetes and containers and service meshes and all the good stuff.
You have a really interesting background, right? So you are not the typical Govy who has spent, 20, 30 years with the Department of Defense or even with some other area of government. I mean, if we look at your LinkedIn profile, you are an entrepreneur at heart. You've started multiple businesses, been very successful. I guess my question is, I know that you've recently made a decision to leave public service, but rather than focus on why you left, I'm curious, what interested you as an entrepreneur in getting into public service first at DHS and then later in the U.S. Air Force?
No, absolutely. I guess it's a very surprising story. I'm a little disappointed or sad that you use a past tense to describe me as an entrepreneur.
You're still an entrepreneur. It's just usually the two don't go together.
I know, I'm just kidding. But it's true in a way, right? And that's also what is scaring me is when you become stale and behind. So I think it's important to have this rotation of talent. And what led me to really join the department first at DHS and then the DoD was after I sold one of my companies. It was the time where, about 5 years ago, when the terrorist attacks were happening all over, including in Paris, where I'm from, although I was born in Marseille. But I guess France is where I'm from. I think I wanted to make a difference and not do another stupid mobile application again. So I started DHS. I was the chief architect and special advisor for cybersecurity and kind of pushed Zero Trust at the time, which, was a little bit too early for the government. Although now, as you can see, the president is pushing all the government agency to jump on the Zero Trust wagon. So I guess I was only a 5 year too early. Then, I got a call to say, hey, how about you come and help us with digital transformation and DevSecOps in DoD? And that's where I started first at OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, at the Acquisition and Sustainment team. And then because of the success of the DoD Enterprise DevSecOps initiative, we created a new office, the Chief Software Office inside of the Air Force. And that's where they moved me as the first Chief Software Officer.
Prior to going on with U.S. Air Force and DHS, what was your involvement with DevOps and DevSecOps? What was that like before?
Yeah, I guess I've been, of course, using all the common sense agile practices for the last 22 years. And even maybe at the very beginning also of the adoption of DevOps and then DevSecOps for my own companies, right? So I was really focused on building innovation and rapid transition to exit. And so I had 180 products I built over the last 20 years that were sold to dozens of Fortune 500 or 100. And that led to a very fast pace. And you realize pretty quickly that to bring to life a quality product and baked-in security and testing, you need to adopt, the principle of Agile, of course, and DevOps and DevSecOps to have that baked-in security. So I guess my own experience as an entrepreneur is what really pushed me to implement those concepts. And of course, it was common sense to bring them with me when we started to do innovation in the government.
So why did you decide to focus on DevSecOps? I'd imagine there was probably a lot of other areas you could have focused on that probably would have been easier. Why DevSecOps? Why did you start there?
Well, I think it's the biggest return on investment, right? You have so many facets of the benefits of using DevSecOps. First is the ability to compete and move at the pace of relevance with automation of testing and security checks, but also injecting that baked-in security so we can reuse containers and Lego blocks across teams. So really, when you take a step back and you look at the impediments that teams are facing today when it comes to the adoption of DevSecOps and the ability to compete against other nations, it's really driven by the issues around accreditation with the ATO, Authority to Operate, but also with the ability to have a fast feedback loop between the warfighter and the development teams, so you're not building things in vacuums. And so really at the end of the day, when you look at the desired outcomes, you realize pretty quickly that DevSecOps is the main enabler to get all of these things done fast, while not creating more risk. In fact, I would argue it reduces both cyber and operational testing risk as well.
So anytime you try to bring something as, I'll call it revolutionary, as DevSecOps into a large organization, be it public sector or private sector, there's always going to be some type of resistance, right? Just because it's new, maybe they're not aware of it. But a lot of the folks listening to the podcast are probably going to be mostly private sector, and they're trying to do the same thing that you did in a massive, massive organization. Where would you recommend they start? Like, what are one or two things that you just found? Obviously, no project's ever 100% perfect, but what are maybe one or two areas that they can start to focus on just to start to get that momentum in the organization?
Yeah, so what's interesting is, I guess if we can do it in DoD, which is really the largest organization on the planet, you can probably do it anywhere else. So that's good news for people trying to do this themselves. So that's the first thing, is don't let people tell you that you can't do it. That's always a good first step. The second big advice is really investing, streamlining the adoption of enterprise services. When we started with DevSecOps in DoD, we created two offices, right? The Cloud One and Platform One team. Cloud One is our cloud office, and Platform One is a DevSecOps platform that can run on any cloud, on-premise, at the edge, and on weapon systems, space systems, and so on. And really, that was a massive enabler to ensure that each team is not reinventing the wheel. When you have a limited set of talents, and you do, regardless if you're a big company or not, these concepts are still very fresh and new. And so by definition, you're not going to see a lot of your technical talent even know what a service mesh is, in which case you want to obviously be efficient. You don't want to create a one-size-fits-all in a bottleneck, because that's where you fail as well. But there is a way to create a platform capability that brings diversity of options while ensuring that the right cyber stack is in place, that the right onboarding and common services are defined. There are many things where you want to have options, maybe dozens of options. We have over 23 databases on Platform One, but then you have other things like Zero Trust, where you want to have one implementation of a policy enforcement point, and then probably a single ICAM, single sign-on stack, so you don't have issues in terms of authentication of person entity and non-person entities as well. So when you start looking at things, you need to find the right balance between too many options, not enough, one, two, single mandated capability, which sometimes you have to have the will to push, because people are always against any kind of mandate. At the end of the day, when it comes to cyber, when it comes to different capability that need to be enforced across the enterprise, that's the most efficient way to get there. We keep talking about federation or compatibility or ability to integrate between different products. It is just never the same when you have options just for the sake of egos. So I think it's also important to define, why do you need it? Is it just for personal preference, or is it really because of a mission need or gap that you cannot solve with something else? And by moving and adopting Kubernetes and containers, what's also very important is the fact that everything becomes modular and Lego blocks. So even if a team does not like a piece of the puzzle, it's fairly simple to replace that one piece and design a customized implementation of that platform in a streamlined fashion while enabling that customization. What's also important to realize is that one size fits all obviously is terrible. So you don't want to start pushing the wrong mandates. So you need to try and see what sticks, but you want to be agile and move fast and learn fast and don't fail twice for the same reason as well.
How did you find that balance between, obviously, like you said, there's certain things in cybersecurity that you have to mandate, but at the same time, you want to be careful what you're mandating, right? How did you attempt to find that balance between mandate versus let's give the teams the flexibility they need to be able to execute their mission? Did you have a framework for that? How did you approach that?
Well, I think you look at the customer demand and then you start comparing the desired options. If they are already pretty similar and they don't really bring different values, that's one thing to take into account. The second piece also that's very important to me is, okay, when it comes to cybersecurity and the ease of consumption of the service, if you look at things like single sign-on, why would you want to have two single sign-on stacks? It just makes no sense. So there are common sense things when it comes to centralized logging and telemetry, when it comes to zero trust policy enforcement points, where even if you think in terms of the technology today, you're not really able to federate truly a policy enforcement point. So you have a technical barrier there that if you let people implement their own zero trust stack in a vacuum, you're going to have effectively as a cohesive outcome a stack that is not a zero trust stack, because by definition, you're going to need to trust other PEPs without ability to truly understand what's going on. And so there are things that you want to have centrally pushed, and it's just common sense. And then when it comes to different tools, a Jenkins versus a GitLab CI or whatever, right? Often you have feature gaps, and it's fine to bring options. What I also realized is at first I wanted to bring many options, but then I realized, wait a minute, when you start improving in maturity, right, you need to start doing more things with those tools. For example, we started to do multi-party signing with TUF and in Toto, so each phase of the pipeline will get signed. Well, now you integrate tightly into GitLab or into Jenkins. If you have to support two products now, you have to do it twice. And then we started to do the proper measuring of metrics with a DORA metrics, right? Mean time to recover, mean time to production. Now you tightly integrate with tools like Jira and GitLab, right? So if you were to swap, I guess, between Jenkins and GitLab tomorrow, well, you have to redo all these integrations, right? And so I started to realize, well, the more you bring options and the more mature you get to become, the more complex your stack day-to maintenance becomes as well. There is a point where you have to say, if the reason for which you want to use Jenkins is only ego-driven, then that's not good enough anymore, right? If it's your personal preference. But at the same time, also you look at cyber findings, right? Jenkins has dependencies that are 7-8 years old, with dozens of CVEs that are not updated. Is that a risk you want to take? So you want to look at the cyber posture of the products. You want to look at the features, the cost, the open source community around it. Is it open source? Is it a COTS? Or is it one of those cost software, right? Commercial open source software that effectively has a foundation of open source, but all the cool or enterprise really needed features like, SAML, single sign-on, and RBAC and different things like that, which are really common sense and really needed for any enterprise of any scale, are now paid feature with closed IP, which is really a model I don't like, right? Because you're pretending effectively to be an open source company, but you're not, right? And so that's also things to think about, right? Vendor lock-in, technology debt. So it's a very complex equation when you take a step back and you look at all the different factors. And it's obviously very opinionated. Two different persons will probably not make the same decisions as well.
I love what you said, though. I think you might be the first person I've heard that say that when you're looking at really standardization of your tool chain, you have to look not just at the capabilities of the individual tools, but you actually have to look at the security of those tools themselves and let that be part of the decision-making process. And that's really consistent with what, CNCF recently released a white paper on supply chain security. I think that's absolutely consistent with that approach.
Yeah, what's interesting is you see a lot of very big Fortune 100 having tremendous tech debt, right? You look at Atlassian, 1,400 CVEs on some of these 8 to 12 years old dependencies. That's just unacceptable today. And then they wonder why they have critical CVEs coming out again and again. you need to take care of your software bill of material, right? It's the same thing also when it comes to the risk of CI/CD pipelines, right? The next big wave of cyber attacks will be targeted against these capabilities, because if you get into the pipelines, you can easily inject malicious code. And if you look at what's going on even recently with SolarWinds, right? If you get into the build server, you can inject malicious code and bypass a lot of the checks of the CI/CD pipelines. That's going to be the weak link. So all these CI/CD tools, all these event scanning tools, and keep in mind, you look at the recent CV of Atlassian, right? Well, Jenkins got compromised because of the plugin between Atlassian and Jenkins. So lateral movement, right, of some of these tools, because of all these non-person entity keys, right, robot keys between product A and product B. And by the way, we're doing a very poor job of access control, particularly when it comes to NP, right, where they effectively have bloated rights to products, and that gives the ability of malicious actor to not only laterally move, but get tremendous access to things, all the way to sometimes even being able to commit back to Git and making code changes just because they got into a CI/CD pipeline or Jira or Confluence or whatever tool. So that's also something to think about, is what kind of access control do you want to have in place when it comes to these kind of tools, and how do you mitigate the blast radius? You've seen also recently with Azure, with the compromise of their Kubernetes capability, where effectively they were using the same shared key, NP key, to manage their clusters. Even though you get a dedicated cluster per customer on the dedicated VM, there was an ability to effectively use the same secret to authenticate, or token to authenticate across all the tenants. So that's another thing, is if you have a multi-tenant situation, you want to make sure your NP keys are created in a dedicated per tenant way. So if a key is leaked into one of the tenants, that tenant or that hacker is not able to get into the other tenants as well.
Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. And for our federal customers, Prisma Cloud is now FedRAMP moderate. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. So you mentioned a couple minutes ago, when you were talking about some of the things that you built during your time in the United States Air Force, you mentioned Kubernetes. Kubernetes obviously is a pivotal point of what you guys did. Tell me a little bit, what was it about Kubernetes specifically that got you so excited? And had you worked with Kubernetes prior to US Air Force and DHS? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so not before DHS, because really that was the beginning of Kubernetes. But yeah, I guess although you do see jobs application asking for 12 years experience in Kubernetes, so who knows, right? So I do not have 12 years experience in something that didn't exist 12 years ago, though. So that's one thing. The reason why we picked Kubernetes is, again, multifaceted, right? One is it's a vibrant open source community. It's part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, of course, donated initially by Google. The beauty there is the abstraction layer. So you have the ability to abstract yourself from your cloud provider and storage and networking capability from a cloud standpoint, from an on-premise standpoint. So it gives you a lot of ability to run anywhere. And that's really what's so critical, right, when it comes to particularly the DoD. If you want to run software all the way from jets to bombers to space systems to clouds, having that abstraction capability and layer to orchestrate and have a very high level of disaster recovery and high availability baked in, and not have just virtual machines, right? That effectively a VM image has to be designed per cloud. So that creates this bottleneck where, in this case, the container can run just anywhere. And so that changed the dynamics of reuse of code and binaries really across the enterprise. And so then you have these Lego blocks you can reuse. Not only that, but then because there's a vibrant commercial community around it, you have so many companies, right, that can sell you a CNCF compliant Kubernetes capability, whether it's a VMware with TKG, OpenShift with Rancher, OpenShift with Red Hat with OpenShift, Rancher with RK2 and K3S, or Convoy from Day2IQ, right? AKS, EKS from Amazon and Azure. All these things effectively our commercial implementation of Kubernetes in different ways with sometimes some level of vendor lock-in. So you do have to pay attention to that. And that's why we mandate the use of only the CNCF compliant capabilities, so we don't get locked into a specific implementation. But that gives you effectively the ability to orchestrate and be abstracted, but also to get support and scale and commercial implementation at scale without having a major risk of getting locked into a single company or cloud provider.
I pulled up some things that were public around, just some of your accomplishments while at DoD, and there's a lot. So I know obviously we don't have time to go through all of them, but maybe from your perspective, which of the accomplishments are you most proud of? Obviously things you can talk about publicly. I think there's, in the general civilian population, I think there's maybe not a lot of awareness of these things. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. What are you most proud of accomplishment wise?
Well, I think some of the biggest success were the ability for us to open source all of the work we've done at Platform One and all the Kubernetes and all the implementation of the platform and all the cyber stack. And so that's been now consumed by dozens of commercial organizations, but also 5 nations, 12 federal agencies outside of DoD are using pieces of Platform One. We also created the hardened container repository, a more secure Docker hub called Iron Bank, which is also open to the world and anyone can consume the containers. We have 900 containers, both commercial products and open source products, which really streamline the adoption of open source, and also non-traditional startups can now get access to DoD in a much more streamlined way. So that was also exciting to see as well. I think, the ability for us to demonstrate we could put Kubernetes and the service mesh on the jet, on F-16, on legacy hardware that's 40 years old, and show that kind of thing is possible. Ability to fly the jet and be able to receive over-the-air updates and decouple the flight control capability from the AI machine learning, more innovative side of the house, so we can effectively rapidly update the more innovative side of the jet and really get access to best of breed AI ML continuous learning capabilities, and do that over the air while flying the jet in 12 days was also a lot of things that demonstrate, if we can do that, sky is the limit, right? And so I think it kind of opens the door to showing that this stuff can be done in the government. And then finally, also we demonstrated that, the government can run a successful enterprise service as long as it keeps not forgetting that this is very much like a company and that the customers are the warfighter and the DoD programs and not the Pentagon.
That's certainly impressive. I know when I first heard this, I thought, this has got to be talking about like theory. This is like theoretical. But you guys, you actually did this. You're talking about jets that actually fly, that are in warfighting operations, right? This actually has happened.
Real flying things, yes.
That's impressive. That's really impressive.
And space systems and so on, yeah.
That's amazing. So I guess a question I have for you is obviously, your time at DoD, how would you like to see DoD approve the acquisition process to foster innovation? Because I think that's part of it, right? That acquisition life cycle. If you could, have a magic wand and change that, what would be some of the things you would change in that acquisition process to really kind of continue some of the work that you did, but also to just increase that pace of innovation for DoD?
Well, I think we need to move away from the water agile fall process, right? Right now, we think we're agile, but effectively we have all the impediments of waterfall and all the impediments of agile for very little of the benefits, because effectively we still buy requirements stuck in time. We don't buy capacity of work. We don't buy skills with a very clear definition of done. So the model we've been pushing at Platform One, we have 275 people at Platform One, and the way we staff the team effectively is by buying skills, because we don't just want to buy wasted time and making sure that, those people do actual work. We have a definition of done in the contracts to say, hey, you need to deliver the code inside of the government furnished DevSecOps environment. It has to pass the pipelines and the tests and the scans. It has to meet the user story intent, and the product owner has to approve that story, right? So there is this delivery mechanism implemented. So effectively, instead of describing all the technical requirements and outcomes in the contract, which ends up creating massive churns every time we need to make a change in a contract, because we are stuck with outdated contract requirements. And so moving away from that and shifting into effectively capacity of work that you can groom your backlog just going through common sense, agile collaboration management tools and not contracting mechanisms. That streamlines the velocity of the teams and the ability to do much more with the money. We estimate at least up to maybe 400% more work being done. And we've seen also just with DevSecOps, the decrease of development costs by 40%, which is pretty significant as well.
So I hear you're using a lot of what I would say, I hear a lot of business terms in there as well, which a lot of times don't typically mix with either cybersecurity or software development. So that brings in my mind metrics, right? Which I think are always key for you have to have in order to judge the success of any program. So specific to, let's break it maybe into two categories, either DevOps and DevSecOps. Are there, let's go back again and let's not assume that everybody listening has got fully functioning DevOps, DevSecOps in their organization. Were there initial metrics that you looked for to kind of judge the success of the program as it matured? What did those look like? Maybe what could you share around that?
Yeah, so of course it depends what you're doing, right? But in case of product, if you have a piece of hardware, the decoupling from the software to the hardware, the ability to release in production multiple times a day, a week, whatever your target is, and tracking that velocity of delivery, but also not just the velocity, but also the quality of the delivery. So mean time to recovery, defects, and the ability to recover fast, fail fast, but don't fail twice for the same reason, learn fast, right? So the reducing the impact. People say, well, we can't fail in the Air Force because we have jets and bombers and nuclear weapons. But well, it depends what you mean by failing, right? When we talk small incremental delivery of capability, you never get to the point where you're going to fail in a way that's catastrophic, right? You need to decouple and cut your software into modular architectures, and then you can effectively update pieces without disrupting the critical flight control and airworthiness of the aircraft. So there are many things to do to mitigate that. So we use the DORA metrics, DORA, right? It's the mean time to production, mean time to recovery, all these. And then I think some of the very interesting metrics for people that do, automotive or embedded systems or IoT devices or whatever is the ability to do hardware-in-the-loop testing, so you can test the software on the hardware. If you look at SpaceX, right, they have 200 developers. You compare that to 4,000 at F-35. Yet SpaceX does 17,000 build of software a day. F-35, doesn't do that. SpaceX can update the software the day before the launch. Often it takes years for software to be updated on the jet, at least before, right? And you look at the number of defects, right? It's also drastic. So when you start comparing also the reuse of code, there's 80% of the code base reused across the 9 platforms of SpaceX, where F-22 and F-35 only share 4% of the code base, right? So again, you're in a situation where you don't have any reuse. It's not modular. It's a monolithic system, which creates a lot of issues to update it. It's improving, and the F-35 team has done drastic work in the last 2 years to improve that, and is getting to become much better. But some of the metrics will be around, mean time to production, hardware-in-the-loop testing, and your capability to test your software, to do regression testing and make sure you're not breaking things on the hardware, and the ability to update the software, a day before the launch, like SpaceX, right? Where often space systems in the Air Force have, and Space Force, I guess now, have a 2 months freeze before launch, right? Where we end up actually being in a more precarious situation because effectively SpaceX has fixed issues that we're not allowing to be installed because we're in a freeze period where their commercial launches have already addressed. And so you're actually creating more risk thinking you're more secure. And so that's why it's always interesting, right? The balance between security, compliance, and velocity, they're all competing things. But at the same time, sometimes you make a decision thinking you're going to increase security and you end up decreasing it because you didn't think of the outcomes. In this case, a perfect example of the 60-day freeze that we removed actually because we were creating more risk than we were solving.
I guess I can imagine how that conversation went the first time when you said, hey, let's remove this code freeze that had probably been there for, I'm going to say, decades. How do you measure, right? Because at the end of the day, I've always been a big fan of, look, you can bring an innovative new idea and people may look at you crazy, but at the end of the day, if you can show metrics, right, that this works, then eventually you will win them over. You may not be able to do everything day one, but if you break it into small bits, you can do that. How did you do that? Because I can imagine, again, we're going to have many of our listeners that are thinking, I want to do all these things that Nic did in DoD. And my company is probably a fraction of the size of DoD. How do you start to gain that mind share around wanting to do things like that?
Well, first, you don't listen to people that tell you not to do it, right? Because if I had listened to most of the people and most of the achievements I've done, people told me I was wasting my time and I shouldn't even bother, right? So don't listen to those people, because effectively you're not going to do anything if you don't even try. And you need to try and believe that you're going to succeed. If you already try in a half-baked way and already thinking you're going to fail, might as well not try, right? So you need to try and to be all in and come up with data, right? And I think for us, why we were able to convince people is, unfortunately, we would probably not have been able to do that if we were just the first one to try it. In this case, by showing the SpaceX data, we're able to show that it made sense and that effectively the risk was increased by freezing the code base compared to the commercial launches. It was very clear. We could compare the data and show the number of defects, number of pending issues and bugs that were already addressed in newer releases that were not effectively addressed because of the freeze on the Space Force side. Those metrics and data points were exactly what we needed to convince people, but you're facing a different issue when you're the first one, right, to try something. That was easy for us to be the second one, effectively. And that's why, people like Elon Musk are leading the pack, right? They're willing to take the risk and measure the risk. And if you don't take risk, you're going to get behind. You're not going to be able to innovate and you're not going to move fast enough. You look at the velocity of SpaceX compared to many others, they are miles ahead, right? And that's because of the measured risk they're taking. But at the same time, you look at the launches they're doing with humans on board, they have had no issues, right? And so I think it's important also to weigh that risk and balance it. It's a tough thing to do, but if you don't try hard enough to innovate and do it in a fast pace, an incremental pace, you're not going to be able to even matter. And I think what is even more scary to DoD than getting hacked or having an issue would be not to be relevant tomorrow, so that no one is even bothering hacking it. That would be pretty bad for everybody.
So what's next for you?
Well, I think I'm going to take some time with the kids. I was lucky to sell 12 companies. So really at the end of the day, for me, that's really the luxury there. I have plenty of time, and I'm going to probably join a few boards and try to help and try to provide advice. I'm going to do a LinkedIn Live every 2 weeks and try to make people laugh and share some interesting advice. And I'm even having this crazy idea of maybe doing some consulting where if companies are willing to do it live and make it public, then I don't charge a dime. So effectively, assuming companies are willing to share enough and without getting into the confidential stuff, maybe too much, but enough so I can help them, then I would be free. That could be interesting. So we can help many other organizations as well.
So if listeners, if they want to connect with you, obviously, I think you mentioned you're going to do LinkedIn Live. So obviously you're on LinkedIn, but what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is definitely the best way. And we're going to do these events, and we have a website there that I'm launching that's going to have a lot of the content and curated content. I'm also really a big believer that education and continuous learning has to drastically change and improve. And so we need to really work on how do we let people learn multiple times a day, and we give an hour a day to people at Platform One to learn, so we don't get behind still, and we can also catch up sometimes. And I'm gonna try to really provide unbiased, created content that are not pushing a specific product versus another, but really help people keep up with what's going on in the world. So
That's great. I love it. Well, Nic, thank you so much. It's been really enlightening having you on the podcast. And thank you so much for all the innovation you brought to the United States and the Department of Defense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com